Welcome to the Fan History Project's Zoom sessions. Today we're going to be doing an interview with Erle Korshak, who has been in fandom for, let's see now, it's 60, 70, 80 plus years, probably more than a good number of us combined. Erle, welcome. And glad to see you. I'm going to start off with the questions with some pretty basic ones. I know you've answered many questions many times in the various programs and interviews, but on this one, we're going to try to cover as much of your career in fandom as possible.
I'll try to keep the answers short so you can get them all in.
Oh, don't worry about it. We've got an hour. We can go much longer if you want to keep talking.
Oh,
but the first one
I'm
is
with you.
okay. The first one is as simple as you can get. How and when did you discover fandom?
I discovered fandom in 1934. I was born in 1923. I mentioned that because that suggests that I was about 11 years old at the time.
Right.
In any event, I've discovered fandom. A friend of mine who was going to school with me, and he became a very famous fan, was Mark Reinsberg. And we were in school together. At that time, I think that I was in the 7th grade. And Mark was already interested in science fiction fandom type of things. And so, because Mark and I were very good buddies, I sort of followed what he was doing. And the first thing I knew, I was involved in it. In other words, Mark introduced me to it because he was already somewhat active.
Okay. So when you got involved, Mark obviously was your first fan, but who were some of the other early fans that you met, and how did you meet them?
Well, let me say this. It was a different world than it is today. In those days, there was, there were probably 100 to 200 fans. I'm talking about fans. People put out fan magazines, people that, that kept up correspondence, wrote letters to the editor. There were obviously thousands of readers of the magazines, but only 100 to 200 active people that you call fans. And all of us knew each other. Either we had met personally or we knew by reputation. It was such a world that in some states, there was only one fan. If, for example, you wanted to contact a fan in Wyoming, you would contact Elmer Purdue. If you wanted to contact a fan in New Mexico, you would contact Jack Spear. Just one, the whole state, just one. So fandom was located principally on the East Coast, then in Chicago, and in Los Angeles.
Okay. Where were you living?
I was living in Chicago.
Okay. So there were a number of Midwestern fans. When did the fans in Chicago sort of get together?
Well, the fans in Chicago didn't get together exactly. It was an interesting situation. The fans in Chicago showed their head following Nikon 1. Mark Reinsberg, by the way, everybody here should know that Mark Reinsberg was the chairman of the second World Science Fiction Convention, Chicon I, and he was the chairman.
Right.
And that was a year or two later, but that's who Mark Reinsberg was. And I was close to Mark. Interestingly, we were all going to the same high school by then. And this is following Nikon. And going to the same high school, interestingly enough, all the fans in Chicago at that time were going to the same high school. And there were two groups. One was with Bill Hamling. Everyone here, I'm sure, knows who Bill Hamling was. He was managing editor of Amazing Stories. He later he published Rogue magazine, and so on. Bill had a sort of a following, Chester Geyer and Henry Bott. For myself, on our group, there was Mark and myself and a fan named Richard Meyer. So at this point, we're talking about Mark and I have already been to New York for Nikon I. When we were in New York, Mark came up with the brilliant idea of let's do science fiction conventions across the country so that everyone would get a chance. So in other words, the first convention was New York, 1939. The second convention, Mark suggested, and of course we got it, was Chicon I, 1940. Then Denver, and then to be the next one would be Los Angeles. What prevented the Los Angeles one was the war. But up to that point, we had moved across the country, New York, Chicago, Denver, and Los Angeles had to wait until the war was over.
Right. So you were all in high school when you took on the responsibility of running the convention.
You imagine, and we were like 17 years old. Yeah, but it wasn't like these days where there are thousands of people.
Right.
I don't remember the number in Chicago, but it was like 100 and 150, something like that.
Okay. That being the case, I imagine some of the management of it and the finances of it, even at that time being small, probably required other help. Now, Bob Tucker said that
Bob Tucker was very important. Of course, he was not in Chicago. He was in Bloomington, Illinois. And when we got the convention, we went down to see Bob, and he joined us. And so the big three in Shaikan I were Mark Reinsberg, Bob Tucker, and myself.
Okay. Who was it who was contacting people to get people to come to the convention?
We didn't have to contact them. I mean, obviously the word was out and everybody put it in their fan magazines. And also the editors of the magazines were very nice, particularly Ray Palmer. Amazing Stories, as you know, was being published in Chicago at that time by the Ziff Davis Company.
Right.
Ray Palmer was the managing editor of their entire fiction group. Ray Palmer was one of the great early fans and a wonderful man. And we were very friendly with Ray, and Ray gave us all kinds of publicity. We wrote an article that he specially printed in Amazing Stories about the convention and then when it happened, we gave him he printed a convention report. He did everything to help us.
Did he also provide any financial help or donate materials?
Well, he didn't give us any financial help. We never asked for any. The conventions the money for the conventions came in two ways. One, there were memberships. Of course, the memberships were nothing compared to what they are today. Those days, the membership, if I remember, was $1. Here there are hundreds of dollars for a membership today. So we got some revenue from memberships, but the principal money for the convention and paying for it was the auction. And there were only several professional magazines, and the editors of all those magazines, John Campbell at Astounding, and Mort Weisinger at Thrilling Wonder, and Ray Palmer at Amazing, gave us a lot of publicity, so that they told their entire readership, and that the convention was going to be in Chicago, and that's how it worked out in those days.
Okay, let me step back a couple of years between when you got aware of science fiction fandom and going to New York for Nikon. What was your fanish activity? Was there publishing fanzines? Was there a club you were working with or participating in?
Well, Joe, I don't quite understand the question. I think I've asked.
Okay, between when you first got into fandom,
yes,
and getting involved with the conventions.
Oh, before I went to Nikon.
Correct. What were your fan activities?
Yes. Well, like I say, the fan activity that I knew of at that time was that there were 6 fans in Chicago, real fans, and they were all going to to Lane Technical High School. And there was Bill Hamley and his group, Chester Geyer and Henry Bott, and there was Mark Reinsberg and myself and Richard Meyer. That's the other group. And then, as I say, and there was also Jack Darrow. He was a famous fan, but he wasn't very active. He did come to New York. As a matter of fact, we knew he was in Chicago, didn't even know him until he came to New York, and we all met him there. And then he went back to Chicago. So he was very friendly to us, but he was not active at all at that time. He was already past, his activities in science fiction.
Okay.
Very famous fan, Jack Darrow.
All right. Fandom is full of feuds, or has been full of feuds and controversies. During the first Worldcon, we obviously had the first Exclusion Act.
Yes.
Were you aware of that at the time, and were a particular side of it friends with either side?
Yes, we were very aware of it. The fans who were involved, there were 2 groups at the New York Convention, in a sense. There was New Fandom, who actually put on the convention. That consisted of Sam Moskowitz and Teresi and Sikora. Those 3 gentlemen put on the show. Meanwhile, there was a group called the Futurians. They were pretty much headed by one of the great fans of all time, Don Walheim. And he had a wonderful group of people that were for Futurians, Frederick Pohl, and Isaac Asimov was active with them, and Damon Knight was active with them. That all came a little bit later, but there were 2 groups, and the Futurians felt that they should be putting on Nikon 1. And the New Fandom group had the idea that the Futurians were a bunch of communists. They were no such thing. Basically, they were into very advanced, social ideas. When I say advanced, a little past where we are, but certainly not, they were not communists. But the New Fandom group, in order to put them down, called them communists. In any event, the New Fandom group ended up by excluding the so-called communist Futurians. And that caused a lot of problems. The fans generally were on the side of the New Fandom group because they didn't want to get involved in all this. But everyone felt that it was outrageous to have excluded the Futurians from the convention.
Okay. There are various
There
reasons
was only
why.
one person, incidentally, who everybody knows who was in both camps, and that's Dave Kyle. And Dave, he was active in the Futurians. He was a good friend of Fred Pohl's, and he was active in the Futurians, but he also came into the new fandom group by letting everybody know that he was completely neutral.
Okay. Well, of the Futurians, Dave and Isaac Asimov were the ones who got into the convention primarily. A number of the others, as you said, were excluded. But obviously, the first side, Dave was actually the instrument from which they got excluded because he was the one who printed the publication they were distributing.
Right. The one that was hidden behind the radiator or whatever.
That's what he has mentioned to me, or had mentioned to me.
Yes.
Okay. When you were doing science fiction and fantasy, and it was a favorite reading and hobby of yours, did it do anything to affect your mundane life, your education, or your career choices?
No, it did not. I didn't see. I wasn't technically active in any way. I wasn't an engineer or somebody that had technical background. Science fiction was just a hobby, but it was not something that I looked at in terms of a lifetime kind of experience in my workforce, in my working life.
Okay.
I was only thinking in those days of possibly of going to law school because my family was very active in the law. And in Chicago, some of my family were everything from mayors in the Chicago area to senators, and all of them were lawyers, and I wanted to be a lawyer, and it had nothing to do with science fiction.
Okay. We have a couple of questions coming, but I want to ask a couple on my own about Shaikan.
Yes, certainly.
What was your activity in putting together the Shaikan?
Say that again, Dave.
What?
Go ahead.
No problem. What was your activity? What was your part of putting together the Shaikan?
Well, my part, there were actually 5 people that worked on Shaikan. The big 3 were Tucker, Reinsberg, and myself. In Chicago, there was Richard Beyer, who at that time was co-editor of Ad Astra, a very nice fan magazine with Mark. And he joined us. And down in Bloomington, there was Sully Roberts, who was a good friend of Bob Tucker's. So in a sense, there were 5 people but the big 3 did 90% of the work.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll go on from there. I believe, Edie, can you let in Kurt so he can ask his question?
Pardon me, again, Joe?
Somebody is going to ask a question to you.
Oh, certainly, any question.
Hi, Earl. This is Kurt Phillips. I'm a associate member of First Fandom, and I'm aware that you're one of our original members of the group. I'm just curious to know that if you feel good about the idea of First Fandom continuing into the far future, or do you feel, as some members have felt in the past, that the organization should come to an end at some point?
To tell you the truth, I'm not really sure what your question is. Can you restate?
The question's about First Fandom. Some people, Dave Kyle, for instance,
Yes.
have stated in the past that he felt that once all the original members had passed on, the First Fandom should come to an end. Whereas I, as an associate member, and many others who are associate members, want the organization to continue. How do you feel about that?
Well, let me put it this way. When First Fandom, per se, the group was founded, and we still have one of the first presidents in Bob Madel, who's still alive, who's reached 100. And anyway, the original idea was that the last fan, what would happen at the end, as every one of the first fandom group died, passed on, and then left only 2 people, then they were to take and inherit the bank account and have a drink for, you know, to commemorate first. In other words, it would be over once the last 2 passed away. But we don't do that now. We have associate members of First Fandom, and there's only 2 of the originals left, myself and Bob May.
Right.
And we're not about to have a drink and cut up the treasury.
That sounds good to me. I'm an associate member and glad to meet another original member.
Well, thank you. I look forward to meeting you person to person at one of these conventions.
Me too.
Incidentally, I might say in passing that I was very active in conventions in the sense of at least of attending. And of the first 15 conventions, I was the only one who, I'm talking about Worldcons, who went to every one of them. Forey Ackerman, who was, of course, the great fan of all times, only went to 14. Now, it wasn't Forey's fault. Apparently, his brother at that time was ill and he was on his way to come. I forget which convention it was, somewhere between numbers 1 and 15, and he couldn't come. So he was only did 14. but I was the only one. Then I gaffeated, and we'll go into that later, I suppose. And so I didn't go to conventions until in the 1980s, when Ray Bradbury was going to be guest of honor. And so I started going again because Ray and I started at the same time, you might say. He was about our age, and we met Ray in New York, and we were all very close. I'm talking about Ray Bradbury.
Okay. Well, before we get to when you gaffeated, there are a number of pictures of you early in the convention periods, going to conventions, and often they seem that you were auctioning things. How did you get involved in auctioning material for conventions?
Well, as I think I mentioned earlier, the financing and paying for the hotel and this and that came out of the auction money. And the professional magazines contributed artwork to us. And then it happened, I had the biggest mouth, so they made me auctioneer. I had no previous expense. You know, I hadn't been an auctioneer previously. But anyway, so I did so well. Pardon me, there were 2 people that did the auctions in those days. Sam Moskowitz was also he did the auction, if I remember, at Nikon 1. I did the auction at Chicon 1, the second, and then from there on, I pretty much did most of the auction.
Well, he certainly was not one of the quiet ones. He would certainly compete with you for having the biggest mouth. I know, talking with Sam years ago, before he had to use the voice box, he was definitely a well-spoken and fairly loud individual when he wanted to be.
Yeah, well, Sam was a super guy and a wonderful, wonderful gentleman.
Okay. How did you, let's get to your publishing career. How did you get involved in publishing?
At that point in time, uh, prior to the war, I had met Ted Dickey, and there was also a great friend of mine Ted lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and which is fairly close to Chicago, I think about 100 miles. And near Fort Wayne was Decatur, Indiana, and it had another one of the very few fans of Frederick Schroer. Fred was a great collector of science fiction books. He had a tremendous collection. I don't know if 1,000 or 2,000, but he had a lot of, he was an outstanding collector. So he had put together on file cards, he had put together the information on each book that he had. And we were, in those days, we thought we might end up by mimeographing all this. But at that point in time, when Ted and I got together, we decided to bring the book out, we planned to bring Fred's collection and other material that we were gathering into a book about books, a reference book. And so eventually, right after the war, we ended up by publishing, we were going to only do one book. It's a great classic in the field. It's the Checklist of Fantastic Literature. And it was published by Shasta, as you know, and it's the definitive book about books, listing of all the books. It's much more than we build up on it. But we were only going to do one book. And at that point in time, we did this checklist, and it turned out to be a fantastic success. The Library of Congress was, in those days, the great authority, you might say, on reviewing nonfiction, on reviewing books of science and what have you. The Library of Congress in Washington. And we had sent in the checklist to them. They wrote up the checklist, and listen to this, and said it was a lasting contribution to the American arts in the field of the humanities. Imagine the Library of Congress. Every library in America bought the book, the checklist. We couldn't believe it. All of a sudden, we're selling these things, and it was expensive because $6 was big money in those days. And all of a sudden, and we sold out the first edition and then did a second edition, and that sold out. So now Ted and I are looking at each other and saying, hey, this is a great field. Why don't we publish some more books? The checklist brought us into it. And so we decided, first we were going to do nonfiction, but then we stopped on that idea and decided to do fiction because everything was open. And we were able to contact and do fiction and have some of the great stuff from people like John Campbell and Robert Heinlein and so on. We had the pick of the crop. And so we started to do nonfiction, and we were at it for a number of years.
What was your first fiction book? Do you remember?
Pardon me?
Do you remember what the first fiction book you published was?
Oh, of course I remember what they were. I don't remember everyone at the second, but of course I have a complete set of every book that we published inscribed to me. There was another set we had inscribed to Ted, and we had another set, well, anyway, to Bleiler. Bleiler got a set of everything that he published and so on, all inscribed by the original authors to each of us.
Okay, what was the first title?
I'm sorry?
What was the first fiction title?
Who Goes There? by John Campbell Jr. And by the way, let me say that we publish not only science fiction books, we publish important ones. Who Goes There was the first important book on modern science fiction. Science fiction was generally space opera prior to that. Anybody that has read Who Goes There knows that it's kind of a social. It's totally different than space opera, and people then started to expand on what would include science fiction. It was a giant of its time, and by the way, we sold about 8,000 copies at full price. That was big numbers in those days. And in those days, the big publishers in New York were publishing 2,000 and 3,000 and 5,000 books by Asimov, Bradbury, and so on, and that's all they could sell. We sold 8,000 of Who Goes There in three printings.
You did publish a number of well-known books. What other kinds of books did you publish in Shasta? Was it all science fiction and fantasy?
Well, now that you bring that up, that's a separate subject. We just decided, Ted and I, that science fiction was fine, and we were doing very well with it. Our best title, I'll just mention this in passing, we sold 11,000 of The Man Who Sold the Moon by Heinlein. We outsold the New York people 10-1. But as they got into it more and more and had more finances, and by our success, we drove ourselves out of the business. Because as it came in, they were able to give bigger advances to the authors, and so we couldn't get the top authors anymore because people like Doubleday and Simon and Schuster and so on, with their much more money, were able to. They started to take the field over. Okay. So that's why we decided we're going to be general trade publishers. And incidentally, you should know this, all the great houses had only one book in a way to make the great firm of Macmillan became great. They published one book, Charles Kingsley's Westward Ho. It was a big seller, and that started them. They're international publishers, Macmillan. The same, they are. Yeah, and you go on and on. I think it was Random House that published Kipling. A Doubleday. Nelson Doubleday was a friend of Rudyard Kipling, and he published Jungle Stories, and that made Doubleday. Doubleday became the biggest publisher in America, but they had one winner to start with, you see. And so we got into it, and I don't know if you want to hear all this, but we got into it, and we were going to do nonfiction other than science fiction. And we had one of the biggest books of the season. And I knew all the New York publishers, and they all said to me, I'm talking about Bennett Cerf, who, by the way, was my mentor. Bennett Cerf owned Random House, as you probably know. And all the big publishers, Knopf, I knew him well, John Farrar, Farrar Straus, they were friends of mine. And that's by that time, because we were active in the American Book Publishers Council. And they all said to me, you've got the winner of all times. We got a book called The Westmore Beauty Book. It was authored by the most famous makeup people There were 5 Westmore brothers. Each had a makeup department and a major studio. They were well known to women. Perce Westmore, who appeared every week, several times on Art Linklater, which was the biggest daytime show on television. And so we had what looked like was going to be the winner of all times, and everyone said, "You're going, you're on." Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. If you want me to discuss why we went downhill, I will do so, but that's a separate thing. Let's answer the other question. I'll fill that in if you want.
Okay, well, actually, the other question is a bit related. It's one of the controversies over Shasta Press. You and I have discussed this before. The farmer controversy, you said, was related to the Westmore book. So,
well, it was related in the sense that the Westmore book wiped us out. Not that it wasn't, we published in 3 editions. It looks like it was going to be a winner. We sold 25,000 copies. Don't get the idea it was a 0, but it wasn't enough to cover the huge expense. Perce Westmore was used to being traveled all over the country. I had to strip him around first class, put him in hotels and so on. He was the front man. We had personal appearances and to sell the book. And one thing and another, the Westmore book looked like it was going to be the tremendous success. It was there, but Perce wasn't able to continue. He had a heart attack, and I couldn't move him around. When he appeared in a given city, we would have 1,000 people show up. We would advertise in the newspapers that he was coming. He was so famous to women, and we would have 1,000 women would come up, at the department store where we were mainly selling the books. Department stores in those days all had a great book section. I'm talking about the May Company, you name it. They all had Marshall Field, they all had book sections. And when we brought in Perce Westmore, they all had a room, and Perce Westmore, at least 1,000 women would come in. The fun part of it was that we advertised, we had the most 2 famous women in America at that time appear for us in the ads. They were friends of Perce. They were the most famous women in the world. They didn't charge us a dime. Betty Davis, the movie actress, was one of them. You remember Betty Davis?
certainly do.
She was the top woman star of those days. And Ronnie Reagan's wife, Jane Wyman, I think it was her name.
Right.
They would appear holding the book in all our ads with Perce. And it would say, our ad said, come in and get this was in the newspapers before, in order to get people to come in. So we would advertise with the department store. They had the cheapest rates because they advertised the most in every city. And our ad said, come in and get a free personal beauty analysis. Well, hey, everybody wants a free personal beauty analysis, every woman, by Perce Westmore. Then when they got there, it ended up a Perce would say, well, ladies, I would love to, I would love to do each one of you. Obviously, I can't. So he picked somebody out of the audience and he did one woman. Did it great. But when they heard that it wasn't going to be free anymore, because then he started to tell them about the book, half of the people would get up and walk out. See? But we sold 500 books every time, and they were expensive books, the Westmore Beauty. But it wasn't enough to cover the expenses, which were huge. The point of all this is that we became desperate for money in order to continue on. The money was there. We didn't know the Perce was going to collapse with a heart attack. See, then I sent him home for a month. He relaxed. He came back. He collapsed again. I couldn't keep pushing him. I couldn't kill him. He was a great guy. So I ended up with bills with my printers and paper. I was just, but Farmer, one thing he did not tell you, and that is we were paying him, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we were paying him something like $100 or $200 a month. He was rewriting. I go for the. He was rewriting his first book, which we were publishing.
Right. It was one
I
of
Hope for
the,
the Flesh, I think it was called.
right. It was one of the books that eventually he rewrote his pieces in the Riverworld series, I believe.
Yes, it was. And then we ended up by signing, we also were going to publish Moth and Rust, was it called? His other great stories, and The Lovers. We had those under contract from Farmer too.
But you weren't able to.
Here's the thing: he received, and I saved the canceled check, and he received about half the money. The money came from a deal that we had made with Pocketbook for an original science fiction novel. I'm talking about Pocketbooks Incorporated, where the little kangaroo, is their colophon.
Right, I know
They were the
company.
biggest company in paper books, and they were friends of mine. Anyway, they did a lot of things with me, and they were wonderful to me. So we had this contest for an original novel, and that's how we ended up with Farmer. And that was going to be it. Before he showed up, we were going to do Frank Robinson's The Power. Frank was a good friend of ours. He lived in Chicago. He and Ted, my partner, were inseparable. They were very close friends. We were going to do Frank Robinson. We should have done Frank Robinson instead of Farmer, but we thought it would be better to do Farmer. And as I say, he was ungrateful in the sense he had to do a lot of rewriting on I Hope for the Flesh. Lyler laid it all out for him, and he was doing it, and it was taking many months, and we were paying him either $100 or $200 a month. That was big money in those days. Don't get the idea. With $100, you can't go to the grocery store now, but that was big money in those days. And he was getting it, and I got the canceled checks to prove it. Later, it turned out, and I talked to Farmer, he realized that he had what he said was a kind of a writer's, not cramp, there's a special word for it.
Writer's block.
That's it. Thank you, Joe. That's it. And that was part of it from his side. But anyway, he got about half the money, and I got the checks to prove it. And I think Sam published them for me at one time. I'm talking about Sam Moskowitz.
Mm-hmm.